It may surprise you, but I don't have a speech impediment, nor am I from the same planet that Tommy Wiseau is from. I am from the great country of Finland, located here, slightly to the south of New Zealand. It may not be perfect, but I do enjoy it here, and part of the reason is that there are some pretty amazing creators and inventors out here. Like Marko Raasina, author of, among other works, the Nerd and Jock series and the Reapfield comics. Or how about the Hydraulic Press channel? Or the YouTube gamer Markiplier? One of those great Finnish works is Stand Still, Stay Silent, the ongoing series authored by Minna Sunbderg. Her previous comic, A Red Tail's Dream, was a fantasy comic largely inspired by Finnish mythology. It ran from 2011 to 2013. However, this current series, launched pretty much right after Red Tail, is even more impressive, with improved art and writing and a much bigger scope, encompassing characters and mythology from all 5 Nordic countries: Finland, Sweden, Fjordboy Sweden, Little Sweden, and Iceland. Although the book's category is fantasy, it is actually set in the modern day. The world as we know it is ravaged by a deadly plague that mutates the world's mammals, except for cats for some reason, into beasts that soon become the dominant species. The name of the comic is essentially rule number 1 of the story. Just like Minecraft has Don't Dig Straight Down, Stand Still, Stay Silent has the titular rule that should be enforced whenever a monster is encountered. Iceland is mostly spared from the plague due to its isolated location and ample supply of geothermal energy, while the other Nordic countries only have small isolated pockets spared from the plague. Despite this, humanity has mostly been able to establish a society of some kind. The world as we know it is composed entirely of the Nordic countries. This, of course, caused a lot of reactions in the comments section. But what about my hometown, Blue Ball, Pennsylvania? Is the author saying we all died? Yes, she did, now shut up. Well, actually, she didn't, and the point is that since the author, being half Finnish, half Swedish, has a good grasp of the Nordics, perhaps that's the reason she decided to make that her setting. You dummy! Of course, that doesn't mean other areas in the world couldn't have survived, and perhaps that will play into the story later, So the whole known world is heavily militarized, fighting back against the monsters and trying to reclaim their own world. The plague-ridden area is now dubbed the Silent World. The story also features mages that can sense the spiritual world, and cats who also have an innate ability to sense the infected. But mostly the fantasy aspects of the storyline are fairly subtle. I really like the unique setting and the way everything is laid out. Oddly, the atmosphere is quite cheery and almost every character has this snappy, Marvel-like witty dialogue going on, despite the fact that most of the world is a living nightmare. The character interactions and the character designs are almost quite cute in a way that doesn't exactly scream post-apocalyptic fantasy, but I consider this a positive. The comic, I'ma just call it S4 to keep it short, is really easy reading thanks to this lighthearted tone. Easily some of the best stuff in the comic are the info pages that pop up between chapters. You can tell the author has a passion for drawing maps and infographs and generally write about the lore of this world. And they're illustrated in this style that makes them look like old papers. Beautiful. There is one thing that might deter potential readers about Stand Still, Stay Silent, and that is that there is a lot of setup. It's not like the fact that the story takes place in a post-apocalyptic world is a secret, so I can tell you guys right now that the story takes almost 60 whole pages before actually jumping to the post-apocalypse. And after that, there's still several pages until we actually get a proper introduction to our main cast. I don't personally mind, but I feel like for many other people this warning is in order, and that's perfectly fine. The prologue also is more important than meets the eye once you read far enough, but of course it's a bit confusing at first. But still, the story is on a relatively slow burn throughout. Some of the early parts have pretty forgettable dialogue from characters that don't really matter. The story is not constantly jumping from one dramatic event to another, but rather there's some slow, meticulous world building going on, which I personally like, but it still gets frustrating at times. Yes, I'm literally scratching my walnut-sized head as drool leaks out of my mouth, screaming at the screen for more action to happen. No, I'm just saying that the pacing of this comic is definitely not for everyone. So what is it that this story is about? Well, as mentioned, most of the known world is populated by monsters, and the plague is still out there. But there are untold treasures, relics of the old civilization still out there, and a lot of people want a piece of that pie. So an expedition is hired to venture into plague-ridden Denmark and bring back anything of value. Due to budgetary reasons, the military crew is small, under-equipped, and all but 2 of them are young and inexperienced. They're gathered from all of the Nordic countries, and once you get to know them, they're actually a really cool mix of personalities, but more on that in the character section. While things seem like fun and games as the crew sets forth towards their destination, they don't stay that way for long, with our heroes having to deal with monsters, ghosts, and dwindling supplies. The early cheerfulness and banter between the gang becomes less and less prevalent as the story goes on. The author also introduces some really cool concepts like a shared dream space accessible by mages that allows characters to communicate with each other despite language barriers. Some of the action scenes are wonderfully tense and there's an inherent creepiness lurking underneath throughout, even during some of the more calmer scenes. And the way S4 deals with characters' death is absolutely amazing, almost hauntingly beautiful. I'm using all of my mental strength to avoid spoiling this stuff for you, but it's really great. Like I said before, the characters are gathered from all of the 5 Nordic countries. Now, to those of you who don't know, 4 out of 5 of those languages are Germanic languages and are fairly closely related. Of those 4, Icelandic is a bit different from the rest and closest to Old Norse, which is perhaps why, along with Iceland being spared from the plague, the language is now the lingua franca of the known world. But not everyone knows how to speak it, of course, just like not everyone in our world knows English. And throw in the Finnish language there, which is completely alien compared to Swedish, Danish and Norwegian, and you got a considerable language barrier problem. This creates some cool and unique challenges for the characters to overcome. And I absolutely love how easily the author portrays people speaking in different languages through tiny flags in the speech bubbles. The characters are all very different from each other, which I like. The quiet and gloomy Finnish mage Lalli is the polar opposite of his cousin and translator, the cheerful and spirited Turi. The spoiled and inexperienced Swedish soldier Emil gives us a wonderful viewpoint character into the harsh reality of the dark world, and the expedition is led by 2 older officers, a badass Norwegian leader type Sigrun and the always calm and collected Dane Mikkel. I have to admit that I'm not a huge fan of the dialogue when it gets too much like Marvel type. You know, when everyone always has to have a clever quip ready as if people actually talk like that? Well, except of course yours truly, since I never run out of clever and intelligent things to say. Admittedly, I wasn't drawn to these characters from the get-go, as, like everything in the comic, they reveal more about themselves as time goes on and endear me on a slow burn. It might take hundreds of pages of story for me to start actually getting invested in action scenes if somebody dies. Of course, not every character is as good as I would prefer. For example, the mission control team that supports the expedition through the radio and put it together in the first place have so far been just kinda bland. Like, I'm still struggling to remember most of their names. So yeah, like with everything else here so far, it will take a while before you get into the characters. I personally was initially drawn in by the fantastic art, which I will cover shortly. Whatever, by shortly I mean right now. Boom. Aside from maybe stuff like Ava's Demon, this is easily some of the best artwork I've seen in the webcomic medium. And I was even more surprised to hear a lot of it is actually free-handed. The landscapes are gorgeous, and like I mentioned earlier, the maps have lovingly detailed illustrations and legends. Hell, it even looks like the paper has faded. But upon revisiting some of the earlier panels, I couldn't help but to notice just how much development the art has undergone. This is of course natural, seeing as the story began being posted in 2013 and is still being updated to this day. In the earlier pages, some of the characters in particular look a bit off compared to the present day, with somewhat messy line art, some lacking details in their faces and some weird shading. It's not terribly noticeable though, more like a testament of just how much an already good looking webcomic started to look amazing down the line. One thing that may bug some people, but is honestly a pro for me, is how the author uses color. S4's characters may look almost cutesy at times, but the colors are always quite muted, and the panels often seem to be covered by a colored hue. In the early panels, the scenes are often covered by this reddish color, while in the later ones I've seen a lot of pale blues. This might be annoying to some people, but I quite enjoy how the color is used to build atmosphere. Speaking of atmosphere, the scenes where the characters sneak through abandoned buildings and such, looking for treasure to take, are some of the best stuff in the comic. The mood and lighting are almost like a survival horror game, and the designs of the monsters and spirits the characters have to face are detailed, grotesque, and incredibly creepy. A wonderful contrast to how the characters themselves look. Like these 2 pages here look incredible, and are a great climax to a tense scene. Speaking of the characters a bit, the author seems to enjoy this chin-length haircut style a bit too much, since it made differentiating between the characters a bit hard in the early chapters. But thanks to the way she uses expressions and poses to convey their personalities quite well, I got over it pretty quickly. Another thing that bugs me came when reading this comic on my phone, traveling to school, work and my weekly War and Feed conventions. The layout of the comic is clearly designed more for print, and the website is not the most responsive one, so sometimes you'll have to do a lot of zooming and moving around in the page. The typeface is also not the most easily readable on mobile, but you get used to it. On the flip side of things, this enables some really creative and amazing panel arrangement and wide pages that will surely look great in print form, so I can't exactly complain. So, Stand Still, Stay Silent is a mammoth to read. I ended up reading over 1,000 pages, and guess what? That's just like the first arc or something. Now I know fantasy is known for being lengthy and seemingly never ending, but I do have to wonder if the story would have benefited from cutting things down a bit. But then again, the slow pacing of the comic makes it unique. I admit I usually like build-up when it's done more efficiently and stories that move at a faster pace with more twists and unexpected things thrown in the mix, but I still like this comic a lot and I highly recommend it. It really hits all the marks and the flaws aren't that big to complain about. Oh, except apparently the cats in this world survive while all the dogs get turned into like zombies or something. Bad comic, 2 out of 10.